Isn't it easy now to say that Gary Yourofsky is just a minor footnote in the history of the vegan movement? Isn't that easy to say in the year 2022? I used to know people who would, with no irony and with real sincerity, passion, and conviction, refer to and talk about Gary Yourofsky as the Martin Luther King of the vegan movement. Their assumption was that this was a man of tremendous power and influence who was going to go on to be even more powerful, even more influential in the years to come. That, you know, whatever significance or notoriety you might have now, appearing on the TV news and so on, just wait, just watch, just wait. And I think you can, I should say, if you're about 45 years old, it's quite easy for you to think back to that time. It doesn't seem like that long ago. Some of you right now might be already kind of nodding your heads ruefully and thinking, oh, yes, I remember when people looked to Yourofsky and thought of him as the Martin Luther King Jr. of the vegan movement. Okay. I got fan mail from someone today who's an 18-year-old viewer of this channel, and he was talking about how advice I'd given when he was 17 changed his life and how he now sees it differently at age 18. Okay, what do you think Gary Yourofsky means to him? You know, like so 5 years ago. Think about the world from his perspective. There are some people in the movement today for whom it's unimaginable and unfathomable, and they're looking back at Gary Yourofsky, like if they now hear about the echo of his former fame and importance. What do you mean? Wasn't it always obvious that this guy was nothing more than a minor footnote in the history of veganism? Who is and who is not a minor footnote? It's obvious in retrospect later when the history is written. And it becomes increasingly difficult to sympathetically and analytically put yourself back in that perspective, earlier period of time. I've always been challenged on this, and I think it's fair to say this is still a tension with my audience after all these years. The audience I have today, some of whom are 18 years old and just started watching recently. Some of you have been here for 5 years, 8 years, whatever the case may be. I think that there is a tension with my audience, whether it is spoken or unspoken, that they are so often frustrated with me because they demand to know, why are you even bothering to criticize Freelee the Banana Girl? Why are you even bothering to criticize Durianrider? All right. I was just looking at another one now. Healthy, crazy, cool. You know, any of these, did I get it wrong? You know, why would you even bother to criticize these people who are nothing more than a minor footnote in the history of veganism, as opposed to the people who are self-evidently of such great importance? Now, this is why I'm making the video. This is exactly what I want to question. This is what I want. This kind of claim that some of us make consciously and intentionally in the context of a debate or something, but a lot of us are just unthinkingly kind of leaning on in our own internal monologue. We treat it as something self-evident that we know, that's well established, who is a minor footnote and who is a major character as this history still unfolds. Okay, so you might think it's obvious that Gary Francione is a much more important person than Freelee the Banana Girl. That Freelee the Banana Girl always was doomed to be a minor footnote in the history of the vegan movement, whereas Gary Francione is of tremendous epoch-making importance. Let me ask you, is Gary Francione the Martin Luther King Jr. of 21st century veganism? Is he? Is he? Because his career is now over. Now we can write the history of that looking back. I know he's not deceased yet, but he is well and truly retired. He's out of the game. Is that his importance? I want to talk about the history of veganism in two very simple phases. The period from 1970 to the year 2000, and the period from the year 2000 to the year 2030. There's a very big difference between these two periods of time. And the difference is what you see right here, the internet, YouTube. How important was Gary Francione? How important was Gary Yourofsky? I've got to drop a lot more names here. How important was Wayne Hsiung, right? And again, some of you are too young to remember. There was a time when I came out and criticized, Wayne Hsiung, and other vegans were just shocked. They were just astonished. And what they had to say to me, not in exactly these words, was, "Don't you realize this man is the Martin Luther King Jr. of our movement? This is the great leader we all have to follow. This is the guy carrying the flag that's going to bring the movement forward." Now, so today, in retrospect, it's very easy to say, "Oh, couldn't you always see the red flags? Couldn't you always see that something was wrong? Couldn't you always see that he was the wrong guy to follow?" Now I could. Again, if you're 40 years old, did you see what was wrong with Wayne Hsiung? Did you see what was wrong with Gary Yourofsky? Or were you one of the people who was giving the most charitable interpretation possible when Gary Yourofsky screamed incoherently on camera and seemed completely insane on any number of issues, including the war between Israel and Palestine, this kind of thing, things that had nothing to do with veganism, where these incoherent breakdowns? Were you one of the people who was rationalizing that and making excuses for that in your head because he was supposed to be our great leader? Like you were imagining he was going to become in future the Martin Luther King Jr. of our movement. And by the way, Martin Luther King Jr. had his own sins that were swept under the rug and ignored by his followers during his lifetime. He was glorified and had things ignored and deleted. With Wayne Hsiung, when he published anti-vegan essays, when he published essays attacking veganism and saying that the animal rights movement should have nothing to do with veganism and they should be separated, and that he doesn't even want to be vegan, he wants to just be an animal rights person, attacking and reviling veganism. I knew when I spoke to people who remained followers of Wayne Hsiung, and in case you didn't know, he ended up dropping that tactic after it sort of backfired for him. I don't know what results he was expecting, but he didn't get the results he was hoping for, though. Okay, were you one of the people who said, "Wow, this is a red flag. This guy is some kind of kook. This guy is crazy. This guy doesn't know what he's doing or doesn't know what he's talking about. This is the wrong guy to follow"? Or did you rationalize it, make excuses for it, right? So on and so forth. When Wayne Hsiung obviously and flagrantly lied in claiming that nobody had ever gone to jail by participating in his protests and his days of action in their method of disruption, as they call it, et cetera, et cetera. When he was lying about that, and at the same time asking for donations to pay for lawyers to help get people out of jail, quote unquote in jail. I don't mean they were literally in jail, but people who are facing criminal charges and the possibility of going to jail. At the very same time, he's begging, he's panhandling, he's fundraising on the basis. This shows there's a serious problem with you morally, if not intellectually. Like this shows this is somebody who's crazy and wrong. This is a bad leader. It's not somebody you want to be involved with. Even in business. I mean, even this guy's owning a company or something. Is this guy you want to be in business with, right? So my point is this. When you're actually living through this kind of political history as it unfolds, your experience of the present, your interpretation of the present, your rationalization of the present, the excuses you make for people in the present, very often derive from a definite notion you have of the future, of who that person is going to be in the future, their significance in the future. All right. Now, as I say, I've had to deal with this both explicitly and implicitly in my conversations with my audience. I feel sometimes it's an implicit tension. Why would you bother criticizing Freelee the Banana Girl? Okay. How many people would know the name Gary Yourofsky if he had not been featured and promoted on Freelee's YouTube channel? To what extent was Freelee herself personally responsible for creating the cultural phenomenon, which now seems short-lived and minor, but seemed enormous at the time, of Gary Yourofsky? Again, I've talked to people who lived through it, and it probably is possible for some internet archaeologist to go and crunch the numbers and try to figure out, the level of fame he had achieved before he collaborated with or was promoted by Freelee, and the level of the fame he achieved after. To what extent was it Freelee? To what extent was it his appearances in newspapers and much later being interviewed by the nightly news and that kind of thing? But, everyone who lived through it, they will all say openly, oh yeah, like Freelee really played a part in making Yourofsky into this towering major figure. Okay. How many people would have ever heard the name James Aspey outside of Australia if he hadn't been promoted on the YouTube channel of Freelee the Botanic Girl? Now, again, someone could try to crunch the numbers. Some of these things are qualitative. Some of them are quantitative. It's not easy to say just how important she was, as opposed to James Aspey appearing in a newspaper article, appearing on television. James Aspey had become known within Australia to some extent, but he was known as a minor curiosity in the news. He was a young man who took a vow of silence, as I recall, for a year. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? To say this is a footnote in the history of veganism would be a great exaggeration. Freelee played a huge part. She was an important catalyst in taking this, minor news story. It's not front page news. I don't know, it's page 6 or page 12 or whatever. This minor news story, and then turning this guy into a champion for a major advocate for a major figure in the vegan movement. Now, I am not saying this to insult you in my audience. Okay, I know a lot of you. Okay, many of you at least had a period of your life where you unironically looked up to James Aspey as the future Martin Luther King Jr. of the vegan movement, if not the present Martin Luther King Jr. of the vegan movement. Okay, a lot of you had a period of your lives in which you looked up to either Hsiung or Gary Yourofsky or Freelee herself or Durianrider himself, right? In which you, with no irony, saw these people not in a detached, skeptical, nihilistic way, analyzing who are you, where do you come from, what have you accomplished, what are your aspirations for the future, how are you going to accomplish those goals, right? Like that's a cool, detached analysis. You looked at them and you analyzed who they were in the present, in the context of the fantasy you had about what they were going to accomplish in the future, right? Now, look, okay, obviously we could give thousands of examples here, but just to give one, all right? The people who really admired Patrisse Khan Cullors, I believe that's how you pronounce her name. A lot of people say Cullors for her name, but regardless, the most prominent founder and leader of the Black Lives Matter movement. Okay. Did they analyze who she was, where she came from, what her specific promises and plans were for what she was going to accomplish in the future, and then whether or not she'd accomplish them? Right. Now, that's what I did, right? With a total detachment. I'm just be honest with you about the order in which I did this. The first thing I looked at were her plans for the future. Like, oh, okay, so this is a political activist and political leader. What do you want to accomplish? How are you going to accomplish it? I looked at the constitution for her political organization, right, which she was accepting donations for, and at that time selling T-shirts for, and so on, right? Okay, so what's the definition of what you're going to do and how you're going to do it and what you refuse to do? I made a video about that at that time. I'm very glad I did, because now all that has disappeared from the internet, right? Now, that was the first thing I looked at. Later, I looked at, what's her education? What university degree does she have? If someone doesn't have a university degree, what kind of job did they do in the past? What has she published? What's her written work? What is her written work about? What are her political positions on a variety of issues unrelated to, unrelated to veganism or unrelated to Black Lives Matter, unrelated to police brutality? What can I know about this person from what they say about politics, economics, so on? And you start to form a kind of detached, rational analysis of who this person is, what's good and what's bad about them, right? That's how I thought about James Aspey. That's how I thought about Gary Yourofsky for all these people, right? Now, what I'm suggesting to you is millions of people, millions, looked at who Patrisse Khan Cullors was, and they didn't ask themselves any of those questions. They didn't do any of that investigating. They didn't think those things through rationally. They thought of who this person is now, and they thought of their bright future. But that future is nothing but a figment of your imagination. Boy, does it move a lot of money. Boy, that confidence in a better future. And we come out of a culture that worships belief, that inculcates blind faith, right? As soon as people are committed to believing in that future, there's this whole deeply Christian discourse that emerges of, don't you want to believe along with me? Don't you want to donate money along with me? Don't you want to march and chant and sing and dance in the streets and hold a sign? And don't you want to be don't you want to be on the right side of history? Don't you want to support the next Martin Luther King Jr.? Okay. There never was any reason to think Patrisse Khan Cullors would be the next Martin Luther King Jr. There was no reason to think she wanted to become the next Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that was what she was trying to do or what she was motivated to do. If you just looked at the life she lived up to that time, what she was doing at the time, what she was planning in the future, you could actually see what kind of a person she was, what kind of agenda she had. I'm not saying she's the worst person in the world, but you could see she was completely the wrong person to play that role that her admirers, her followers fantasized for, because all it was a fantasy. Shall I repeat that verbatim about Durianrider, about Freelee, about Gary Yourofsky, frankly, about Gary Francione, about the most respectable of these people, let alone the least? All right? So look, I'm not getting a lot of questions from the audience here. And Melissa is also a valued member of my audience. She gets to ask her questions verbally. The question I am putting to you tonight is, who is and what is going to be just a minor footnote in the history of the vegan movement? And what is really going to matter, right? Now, look, okay, all right, okay. Up to a certain point, people really believed in James Aspey. It may sound like a joke. It's not. And in James Aspey's case, maybe the comparison to Martin Luther King Jr. is a bit of a stretch. Maybe you have to come up with some other more kind of hippie Hindu long hair spiritual gurus, motivational speakers. Maybe people thought of him as in a slightly different category from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. However, they thought this was a great and important leader for veganism, and they donated money. They didn't just believe in him. They voted with their wallets, and they created this international superstar. And as you know, he very much believed in his own international superstardom. Okay. Now, James Aspey, always a big part of his story was that he was a drug addict. Okay. Now, in my biased opinion, he still is a drug addict. Marijuana counts as a drug, people. And, I think if you go back and look at it with detachment, you can see this is a guy who always cared about money, fame, power, respect, sex. Like, he always wanted to have this kind of rock star lifestyle. And now, by the way, you can go watch my videos that analyze and take it apart. I mean, eventually the facade kind of broke down and he admitted what his motivations were and what his methods were and what he was trying to accomplish and how he wanted to accomplish it. Okay. So now in retrospect, you can see this. All right. I think the easiest way to say, the clearest criteria for us to determine who is and who is not a minor footnote in the history of the vegan movement doesn't have to do with their accomplishments, doesn't have to do with the size of their audience. It actually has to do with their motivations and with their moral and intellectual character. All right. We know what James Aspey was trying to do, right? And we also know, in a sense, why he could never do it or why he could never accomplish more than he did. And that has everything to do with his stupidity, it has everything to do with his moral character, so on and so forth, right? Now, guys, if you have been watching this channel lately, you have seen the dramatic revelation of who Erin Janus really is. And I don't get any thrill out of doing it, guys. I do not enjoy exposing and criticizing Erin Janus. I don't. And I wouldn't blame you if you thought, wouldn't blame you for having the mistaken impression that I take a certain gleeful joy in this. All right. But it's indeed with a certain kind of dread and a certain kind of relief. It's okay, finally, it's on the historical record just how crazy and this person really is. And in as much as she is an important leader in the vegan movement, her leadership is dangerous because she's so crazy. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, there's a YouTube video that's actually on one of my other channels that is called The Politics of Being Erin Janus. You get the whole story bundled up in one video there. Okay. Now look, okay. So when you're in the middle of it, when history is unfolding, people believed in the leadership of Erin Janus. To what extent you want to compare her to Martin Luther King Jr., to what extent you want to compare her to Mahatma Gandhi, because again, there was a spiritual component to this, right? It is now easy to say Erin Janus is just a minor footnote in the history of the vegan movement. Why? She got more views on YouTube than I did. So did James Aspey. So did Freelee, right? Why? Because of her intentions, because of her moral and intellectual character. She'll never matter. She never could have mattered. And in retrospect, it's even easy to see and feel like, oh, well, she never did matter. This never meant anything. At the time when you were living through it, the vast majority of people, not me, but the vast majority of people, they don't analyze what she's saying now, what she's doing now, or even what she's telling you her plans are now. Like when she's doing fundraising, hey, if you donate this money to me, here's what I'm going to do with it. They don't analyze it in that way. They look at her now and think about the glory of what she's going to accomplish in the future. It's her future accomplishments that give her the appearance of greatness, that give her this long shadow. Right? I would say this again, it's not just Erin, it's all of these figures. They seem to loom so large in the vegan movement. And now we can say they didn't really matter at all. And now it seems difficult to even imagine that they were ever so important to people. Again, Freelee was tremendously important to people. Durianrider was. I've made many, many videos talking about that. I don't trivialize it. I'm pointing to a problem here. As with all these things, my bottom line is to talk about what you are going to do with the next 5 years of your life starting today. The problem I'm pointing to here is a problem in the perception of reality, how we think and feel about politics, and how we decide, well, what it is we're going to do next, and then get out of bed in the morning and go and do it ultimately. As I said earlier, I want to talk about two periods in the history of the vegan movement. 1970 to 2000, and then 2000 to 2030. In an earlier video, it's maybe just 2 videos before this, I was criticizing the YouTuber Rationality rules. And I said with total conviction and no vacillating and no exceptions that the philosophy of Jeremy Bentham is completely trivial to veganism now in the 21st century. In the idiom of this video, we can say, look, the philosophy of Jeremy Bentham is a footnote in the history of the vegan movement. There's some mild curiosity about it. But I was warning, I was saying, look, a small number of nerds in these internet forums like Discord, to them, Jeremy Bentham is a big deal. But let's really face up to it. Jeremy Bentham has not been, is not now, and never will be important for the vegan movement. He is a minor footnote. Okay, now, a claim like that is neither going to be true nor false. You got to calibrate it. It's going to be true compared to something else, right? Between the year 1970 and the year 2000, which was more important for the development of veganism? The philosophy of Jeremy Bentham or the Rastafarian religion? If you think I'm joking, I'm not. I'm dead serious. Between 1970 and the year 2000, the Rastafarian religion influenced millions and millions of people. Yes, a lot of it through music. Yes, a lot of it through concerts. If Jeremy Bentham could have concerts with millions of people singing his philosophy, you think he wouldn't do it? You know what I mean? Like, don't look down on Rastafarianism, because most people heard about the religion through music. I mean, some people through reading a book or something. But sure, music was a huge part of how Rastafarianism became so influential. Rastafarianism resulted in millions of people either becoming vegetarian or trying to be vegetarian. We all know there's a failure rate in these things, both for vegetarianism and veganism. Their idiom was to talk about vegetarianism and righteousness, not veganism. But as you can imagine, that created a basis for and an interest in veganism throughout Black American culture, Black British culture, Black Caribbean culture to some extent. And yeah, millions and millions of white people listen to Rastafarian music too, in case you don't know. This is enormously influential. Okay, so now already with just this one example, right? And think about the years 1970 to 2000. In that span of time, what was more influential in the development of veganism? Jeremy Bentham is this tiny footnote. And actually, Rastafarianism is something that we have to take seriously. Okay, there was, in the same period of time, 1970 to 2000, a massive level of public interest in the United States of America and Western Europe and Australia, a massive level of public interest in the philosophy of Hinduism. I don't even have to specify which philosophy within Hinduism. Let's just broadly say in a category, the philosophy of Hinduism. Now, Hinduism doesn't preach veganism. Rastafarianism also doesn't preach veganism. In case you didn't know, Jeremy Bentham doesn't preach veganism. He doesn't. Okay, it's such a joke trying to make a big deal out of Jeremy Bentham. Any one of these kind of philosophers only kind of matters in a parlor room. You got to keep this in mind. Okay, all right. There is one of my rivals here on YouTube, Hitomi Mochizuki. Hitomi Mochizuki as a unique historical individual. To what extent was her interest in veganism shaped by the culture that emerged and persisted from 1970 through the year 2000? The cultural fascination with Hinduism, cultural fascination with Rastafarianism, a number of other African American new religious movements, like the 5%er movement. 5%er movement influenced me. If you don't know who the 5%ers are, have you heard of the Wu-Tang Clan? Every Wu-Tang album, if not every song, has 5%er preaching in it. This very peculiar, small, new religious movement from the United States of America, right? I didn't convert. I didn't become a member of the faith or anything, but I heard those lyrics. I heard them 100 times. Yeah, it influences you, right? Other eccentric new religious movements in the United States, like the Black Hebrew Israelites, right? If we take those together in one category, along with Rastafarianism, all of a sudden you realize, oh, well, African Americans have decades and decades of interest in vegetarianism, ethical vegetarianism under different, you guys probably know about the Seventh-day Adventists, all right? A unique individual like Hitomi Mochizuki emerges out of the cultural stew of these important influences. And in saying they're important, I of course I don't mean to say that they're good. Of course I don't mean to say that they're good or they're intelligent or what have you. We can sit here and talk about the importance of Adolf Hitler and how much influence he had or something. It's not praising him. It's just acknowledging historically that who's had more influence in the history of the world, Jeremy Bentham or Adolf Hitler? I'm sorry to break it to you, but the philosophy of Adolf Hitler is complete horseshit. It's completely insane. Apart from calling it evil, it's stupid. It's stupid and it's crazy. Well, okay, guess what? Jeremy Bentham, didn't add up to much. His influence in the history of the world, especially not if talking about 1970 through the year 2000. So these kinds of claims, and so I'm saying this as someone who's just published a book talking about vegan politics, talking about the philosophy of veganism, talking about putting two together now, vegan political philosophy. I'm totally aware that many of my colleagues will be ready to snub me and say that I'm nothing but a minor footnote in the history of veganism. I want to talk about intention. I want to talk about moral character and intellectual substance, okay? I am aware that Earthling Ed and his book is going to sell more copies than my book. I am aware that Dr. Gregor's How Not to Die. It sold more copies, what have you. All right. But I am really seriously asking the question of whether or not we are going to look back at Dr. Greger the same way that today we already look back at Gary Yourofsky and we shrug and say, he was just a minor footnote in the history of the vegan movement. Okay. Is Dr. Greger going to be the Martin Luther King Jr. of veganism? Like, you look at what he's done in the past, you look at who he is, the background he comes from, you look at what he's doing right now, you look at his constitution, so to speak, how he defines the multi-million-dollar organization he's the head of. I've had videos in the past talking about the budget, just how much money they've got, right? And then you ask, where is he going from here? What is he going to do with these millions of dollars and this fame he's accomplished, fame he's attained, what do you want to say? Where does it go from here? Now, I am not predicting that his career is going to end the way Erin Janus's career ended. I'm not predicting it's going to end the way James Aspey's career ended either. I'm not predicting it's going to end the way Durianrider's career ended. Okay? I think that simply he is a burnt match, that the potential he had, it has burnt out, it has come and gone. And that what I'm expecting in the next 5 years, what I'm expecting Dr. Greger to accomplish in the next 5 years is nothing. I think he is going to accomplish nothing more than the perpetuation, frankly, of his own wealth. All right? Now, why? Has to do with intention. It has to do with intellectual and moral character. When I look at Gary Francione, okay, we do not have a formal system of aristocracy in the United States and Canada. We do not call people Duke, Duchess, Baron, Viscount. We don't use those words. All right. But in our social hierarchy, in our economic hierarchy, it's very plain to see that Gary Francione came into this game as an aristocrat at a very high level. All right. Think about the profession he had as a lawyer. Think about the position he attained as a professor of law. And I have had several vegan activists complain to me. You know, these are complaints, so they may not be entirely factual, but they complain that he's actually enormously wealthy, and they know this from having worked with him and talked to him. They're not so far removed from it, so, and that he's not really doing anything for the future of the movement, given his tremendous wealth and power. Now, look, what I would say back to that, if you're confused about how wealthy he is, I don't even know if his parents were wealthy before him or his grandparents. I don't know if he has inherited wealth or not. Just look up how much a professor at his level makes per year. It's just with no other factors. Of course he's wealthy. Of course, all my professors were wealthy. I didn't have any poor professors here in Canada. I had professors making over $100,000 a year. I don't know about you. How about professors of law? Professors in the Department of Law. You know, you can look it up. I don't know. I can't say this for every single university in the world. At my university, I could look up exactly how much money the professors made. I've made other videos talking about that. It's not the only way to make money. It's probably not its only source of income. I don't mean anything bad by that, but just say I have no reason to assume that that's his only source of income. This is a tremendously wealthy, tremendously powerful person, and thus it is completely unsurprising that he was able to attain a certain level of respect, power, and influence in the vegan movement. Now, I'm just being real here. I am not old enough to remember a time in which people looked at Gary Francione the way I can remember them looking at Gary Yourofsky. I cannot remember. I just wasn't alive. I wasn't there. It's so long ago. So he was present. He was in the room when PETA was founded. He goes way back. Gary Francione. He's a generation earlier, right? But if you knew someone from the right generation, they would be able to remember a time when vegans looked up to and looked at Gary Francione as quite possibly the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. of the vegan movement, where there was that hope, there was that aspiration. oh, here's this guy. So again, it depends what stage he's at. Whether, as a lawyer, as a professor, and so on, is obviously his power and wealth and fame increase. But here's this guy who's completely committed long term to the future of the vegan movement, who starts in such an extraordinary position of power and influence. Now, so again, this is someone who's now retired. He's not deceased, but he's published his last book, as he explained it himself. If he goes on to publish another book, I'm happy for him. But he said this was his final statement about the vegan movement and so on when he published that book. And I've reviewed the book. His final statement on the political philosophy of veganism. You can draw your own conclusions. At any point during that long career, you could have asked of Gary Francione in your own mind, what are you going to accomplish in the next 5 years? The same question I'm asking today about Dr. Greger, the same question I asked more than 5 years ago about Gary Yourofsky, the same question I asked about Wayne Hsiung, the same question I asked in really what was like an 8-year mission to really survey, analyze, investigate, and understand what was going on in the vegan movement, a mission that ultimately concludes with the publication of my book. It's only a 100-page book. You can read it pretty quickly. It's short but hard-hitting. Veganism, Future of an Illusion. This is the book that gathers together all this stuff I learned from all these years of investigation, right? I was looking at these people, and when I was talking to them face to face, I asked them directly, where are you going to be 5 years from now? What do you want to have accomplished 5 years from now? And what are you going to do to get there? So sometimes I did talk to them directly. And when I wasn't talking to them directly, when I was asking you guys in the audience, I was asking you to consider yourself and ask the same question. But I was asking about them. Look, guys, where do you really think this Gary Yourofsky act is going? This guy who's crazy, and I had this clip I played of him again and again where he was talking about getting guns and shooting people and using violence. We had these other clips where he was saying crazy things about Palestinians and Israelis, right? You had all these signs of how insane he was and the role of violence in his thinking. And I'm asking you the question, okay, so where do you think this is heading, right? And various suggestions that it was nowhere good. And I was right. So, you know the story, how the story ends for you. Okay. These were people given extraordinary opportunities, extraordinary power, extraordinary influence. And look, to some extent, they earned it too. To some extent, they had talent. I'm not saying it was given to them for no reason at all. But these were people who had opportunities that probably nobody in this audience will ever have. And a lot of other people might have wanted to have those opportunities. A lot of other people might have wanted to be on stage or to have that interview with that television station and speak to the news, or have that position of leadership, or have that, frankly, money. So ultimately, a lot of this comes down to donations given to vegan organizations, so on and so forth. Okay. Given the extraordinary power, wealth, fame, respect, influence held by Gary Yourofsky, why did he accomplish so little in the last 5 years of his career? Given the extraordinary wealth, power, fame, influence, why did Gary Francione accomplish so little? Why did Earthling Ed accomplish so little in the last 5 years? And what do you think he's going to accomplish in the next 5 years? Why did Joey Carbstrong accomplish so little in the last 5 years? And what do you seriously think he's going to accomplish in the next 5 years? Paul Bashir, if you don't recognize the name Paul Bashir, the founder and leader of Anonymous to the Voiceless. And we've all seen the numbers for how much money he was given. He had this big financial scandal, embarrassment of riches, because he did receive a lot of money in donations. For some of these guys, we don't know how much money they got. Okay. Why did he accomplish so little in the last 5 years? And what do you think he's going to accomplish in the next 5 years? It comes down to intellectual character, moral character, and intentions. Because when you look back in retrospect, very often you say, oh, but these people weren't really lying to me. James Aspey never really promised he was going to accomplish anything, did he? It's not like he let me down. Like what was it that James Aspey ever promised me? What was it that Freelee or Durianrider ever promised? What was it these people were supposed to accomplish that they didn't? All right. And now beyond that, the real question is, in your mind and in your heart, what was it you felt they should have accomplished, but they couldn't because they lacked the necessary intellectual character? They lacked the necessary moral character. And they didn't even have good intentions. The most important lesson for you to learn from the very recent history of the Black Lives Matter movement is that if the people in charge, the leaders, if the people who have executive power are of the wrong intellectual character or of the wrong moral character, if they have the wrong intentions, it does not matter how much money you pour on them. It does not matter how many interviews with mainstream TV channels you manage to usher them into, you manage to arrange for them. It does not matter how many books you publish, mainstream publishers, how much promotion you give them. And it does not even matter how many thousands or how many millions of people march in the streets, scream or chant their name, hold up signs. No matter how much support they get economically, politically, in all of these ways, no matter how much money, fame, power, respect, and sex they get, no matter how much is poured onto them or poured into their organization, they will accomplish nothing, because an institution is nothing more than the lengthened shadow of just one man. The defects of moral and intellectual character, the defects in the plans, in the stated intentions, the articulated goals and the constitutions of these organizations, they doom them from the first. No matter how bright they may burn on social media, no matter how huge an audience they may command for a short time or for a long time, as Gary Yourofsky once did, as Freelee once did, and so on, right? They are doomed to be remembered as nothing more than footnotes in the history of the vegan movement.